Hello. Orpicha kuna, sonkocha kuna, ayumasi kuna, imanaya kajankichis, ayanchu, noka, hawatai, kani. 500 years ago, a group of explorers left the western tip of a vast Eurasian continent and landed on islands next to another vast continent, a land that we now call the Americas. That fateful encounter between two worlds will prove to have immense historical, social, and as we'll learn in this panel, it'll have immense linguistic consequences. I'm pleased to be joined by two experts on this topic, Professor Bruce Mannheim and Professor Martin Vega. They will share their expertise with us on two of the most widely spoken Native American languages in Central and South America, and they are Quechua and Nahuatl. Our first speaker in this panel is Professor Bruce Mannheim. Dr. Mannheim is Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Michigan. He has numerous fine publications on Quechua linguistics, poetics, and most recently, Quechua ontology. Today, he will talk to us about why the way we teach indigenous languages might be, as it turns out, completely wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelt.
Thank you. I'm not going to actually speak about how we teach indigenous languages might be completely wrong, but I might talk about how we study indigenous languages might be wrong, is in particularly with respect to the Quechua case. So, Jibwe runach pachamantang apumantang rimai permisuta manyakuai. So I want to start by, and so one difference between the talk I present and the earlier talks is I'll be looking less broadly at language endangerment and more on a particular problem that's involved in language endangerment in Andean South America. Instead of imposition of the colonial language Castilian on an indigenous population, the Spanish settlement of the southern highlands of Peru resulted in the emergence of a set of settler registers of two of the indigenous languages, registers that remain living languages today. So along with indigenous varieties of Quechua, which is itself a whole language family, roughly of the depth of Romance, and indigenous varieties of Aymara, yet another language family, there were settler varieties of Quechua and settler varieties of Aymara. And that's the settler registers of Quechua and Aymara were regimented to Spanish semantically, pragmatically, and to some extent structurally as well. These varieties, the settler varieties, have persisted. They're still living languages today. They're spoken primarily by the descendants of an old landowning class, and they're spoken also by people who work as interpreters and work as promoters in non-government organizations, work as Quechua teachers, so there's a little teaching for Howard, and also work as language consultants. And the problem that we're faced with then in doing scholarly work on Quechua languages and Quechua cultures, notice the plural, is that it's all filtered through an overlay that's been regimented to Spanish. And so I'm going to talk about what the nature of the overlay is, what the indices of the overlay is, how the overlay is how the differences between the indigenous varieties in the overlay are perceived in southern Peru today, and then what the consequences are of, for linguistic description and for ethnographic description, both. And the consequences are, as you might gather, unhappy consequences. And so I've also got someplace here a list of questions to address later on that I hope to end with. They were handed to me as I walked in. So let me begin. Let's see. And here's basically a game plan of what I'm going to talk about, which is, do I have anything in front of me? I don't. I'm going to have to turn around to be able to read this. I'm going to first talk about register stratification of Southern Quechua, the historical roots of the overlay, which are in the 16th century, and the political economic ground of the overlay, which was a system of landed estates, and then the collapse of the political economic ground beginning in the second half of the 20th century. So we're looking at a sociolinguistic situation that's changed within the living memory of many people who are engaged in it today. The second general point is that the register stratification system provides a qualitative boundary between first language Quechua speakers and, oh, look at this, great, thank you. There we go, I can stand in front of here. Rigid qualitative boundary between first language Quechua speakers and first language Spanish speakers who've learned Quechua. Both populations in some part bilingual. The second one entirely bilingual. The second one, the overlay speakers, entirely bilingual. And the way that's evaluated. And then the third general point is that the overlay, or what's sometimes called mestizo Quechua, is the unmarked category in the racialization configuration in the Southern Highlands, and that this relationship has been misrecognized by and large, both by locals and scholars alike. And then I want to talk about what is to be done, because what is to be done includes some very long-range sorts of things, but also some very short-range desideratum that are worth considering. I'm going to start with a map just to locate the place I'll be talking about. I'm going to make this go away now and work from paper. I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way. I'm going to start with a map. This is only Peru. Quechua languages are spoken in 6 South American republics, starting in southernmost Colombia and carrying across the Andean mountain range, an adjacent coast and adjacent Amazonian lowlands, going all the way from Ecuador through Peru. This is Peru, Bolivia, northwestern Argentina, and northernmost Chile. So it's a very widespread language family. The number of speakers is much open to debate. There are numbers given normally around 8 million. Those are the numbers that have been given of number of speakers since the 1960s, basically, and they're based on guesstimates. They're based in part on census data, and really poor quality census data at that, and they're based on extrapolations for the most part. We do not have any good reliable data on the number of speakers currently in this whole region, and we also don't have any data on what it means to be a speaker. We have no data on, with one single exception that was collected accidentally, which I collected accidentally, for one community, we do not have any data on the extent to which Quechua is being reproduced across generations in a normal fashion, namely children learning the speech around them, and the extent to which households are strategically giving up Quechua to speak Spanish. There's a great deal of anecdotal evidence of the second. If I understand the overall situation properly, we're in the midst of a demographic collapse, but we don't have the data to show how that's worked. So the map here shows areas in which Quechua languages or Aymara languages are spoken in Peru today, and the extent to which there are also populations of Spanish speakers whose parents are Quechua Aymara speakers. And the point I want to call attention to is that the shaded areas are virtually continuous across the country. That, in fact, there's a serious presence of indigenous speakers throughout the country. There's an especially strong concentration in the South, and there's 6 southeastern departments in which as of 50 years ago, Quechua is not only the dominant language demographically, but came close to being the only language spoken outside of urban areas. And that's no longer the case, but I'll get to why that is. Now, I've alluded to a register system, and that is a differentiated hierarchy of varieties of Quechua. There are 2 ways we can talk about about differentiation in the Quechua language family. One is geographically identified varieties. That's the traditional way of describing it. That's also the way I described it in my book, The Language of the Inca, since the European invasion. But there's also a vertical stratification of varieties of Quechua. And the register system, I've used mainly phonological data, mainly data from the sound system, to distinguish 3 different registers. And what I'm going to show you is that at least one point in that differentiation of the 3 registers is in fact socially salient to speakers, including both first language Quechua speakers who speak Spanish and first language Spanish speakers who speak Quechua, and that it's the basis for social discrimination. But what I want to do is start with some very broad features, broad linguistic features, and the main point to make here is that the overlay is regimented by Spanish. It's fit onto Spanish semantically, syntactically, and pragmatically. And just a few of the points of difference I have listed here on the slide. The verbal agreement system is different, greeting routines are different, and culturally central vocabulary are different. And I want to start with the verbal agreement system. Quechua has always been described as a nominative accusative language like Spanish or English, but it turns out they're very strong parts of the syntactic system that use two other kinds of agreement systems: ergative alignment and semantic alignment. These are technical terms. The critical thing to take away from this, though, is that the agreement system is a major linguistic marker of how social and cultural agency is described, what kinds of beings can be agentive, including whether, for example, places and particularly mountains, can be agentive, whether humans are agentive in all situations, it turns out not to be so, and so forth. All of that's in the verbal agreement system. So there are two different verbal agreement systems between the two. Actually, there's one that matches Spanish, and the other that has a verbal agreement system of the complexity that one finds in some languages in the Western Amazon. We do not yet have a really well worked out and substantial description of the monolingual Quechua system of verbal agreement. Doesn't exist. Greeting routines. If you meet someone, and Howard Tsai was quite correct in the way he opened up, you'll say something like, "Is it good?" You'll get a response, "It's good." You might ask, "Are you here? Are you moving toward here?" "Yes, I'm moving toward here." Those are perfectly fine greetings. If you are working through a greeting system that's constructed in the overlay, you'll say something like "good day" to people, and you'll get "good day" back. And they're very subtle, different claims as to social engagement, in that more salient if you are walking on a mountain pathway and you're by yourself and somebody runs into you. If you're speaking the Quechua of first language Quechua speakers, the question that they will ask you is, "Where are you from?" And you will have to ask them where they're from. The place they're from is much more important than who they are personally. After you've asked where they're from, and they'll give you a community name, the correct thing to ask is, "Which one are you?" Of the people from that. Your identification as a person is with a commune, not as an individual. If you are an overlay speaker, your question will be, as in English, for example, "What's your name?" And it may be that you're interacting with this person for a while and you never really get the name of the person, because when you ask, "Which one are you?" they might say, I'm so-and-so's older brother," or something like that. They might identify themselves through somebody else. There are differences in vocabulary that ethnographers have treated as, and also archaeologists have treated as culturally central to Quechua speakers and to their Inca ancestors. And two very, very quick examples, which I've written about or spoken about in other contexts, is a word for that's usually translated as reciprocity, Aini. And if you read anything about the Andean region, the first thing they'll tell you is that people are engaged in Aini with each other and reciprocal work with each other, that there's harmonious exchange of free labor between people. That sense of Aini can be traced to a single text from 1925 by a speaker of the overlay. That's an overlay meaning of Aini. In Quechua culture, Aini is asymmetrical. Aini is power-laden, and Aini would be best, perhaps most closely translated as sacrifice rather than reciprocity. A second key term that people talk about a lot, and pretty much if you go out on the street in Cusco, you'll see people selling books about Quechua people, and there'll be books with titles like "The Quechua Philosophy of Aini." There'll be CDs sold by bands called Aini or something else but titled Aini. So this is a kind of a pervasive notion in Spanish-speaking popular culture in Peru. A second term that gets discussed a lot is huaca, which normally gets translated as sacred, but it turns out that, first of all, it's not I've translated as sacred as an adjective, but it's a verb, it's a noun in some cases, and it's an adjective. To describe things as waka, this, which Vulcan salute, that's waka, because I've created a furrow between my fingers. And there's another context for this that I'm not even going to repeat in front of this audience, though I have published it because you can avert your eyes in that context, that will lead you to imagine that there's no way on earth this could mean sacred, and yet we've spent ink and paper trying to explain what waka means and how certain things are waka and certain things are not waka. And this is all our invention. This is all something that we've largely come up with, we being scholars, we being also the speakers of the overlay. So now I want to talk about one minor trace of the distinction between first language varieties of Quechua and the overlay, and that has to do with a phonological feature. And the phonological feature, and I'm going to cut to the chase on this one, depends on how much space above the larynx is being used in the buccal cavity, basically the mouth. Quechua speakers have a narrower use of the narrow use of the buccal cavity. First language Spanish speakers who speak Quechua have a buccal buccal habits, have a buccal habitus that largely follows Spanish, and that has consequences for the way vowels are produced. And the consequences are the following: that Quechua speakers have smaller space for producing vowels than Spanish speakers, and so first language Spanish speakers who speak Quechua speak with the 5 cardinal vowels of Spanish. Quechua speakers who are first language Quechua speakers speak with 3 vowels that correspond no place to the 5 cardinal vowels of Spanish. They're not a subset or anything, and the place where you can pick this up is in the behavior of vowels adjacent to a set of sounds called uvulars that are way back in the mouth, that both first language Quechua speakers and first language Spanish speakers produce in Quechua. And let me give you an example of what it sounds like. The distinction I'm imagining here is between, here's a word that sounds like something in English, caca. Here's a word for stone in Quechua, caca. So the uvulars, the second one has uvulars, and they're way back in the mouth, near the uvulum. Not surprisingly, guess why they call them uvulars. For Quechua monolinguals, the vowels adjacent to uvulars are backed. They're pulled back, which is precisely what you would expect. For Quechua dominant bilinguals, people who've learned Quechua first and Spanish second, they are trying to adjust themselves to the 5 vowel system of Quechua. So adjacent to uvulars, vowels get lowered. So instead of saying kiki, which would be what a monolingual would say, they say keke. The vowel gets physically lowered. For Spanish-dominant bilinguals, or people who've learned Spanish first and then Quechua, they have to learn everything by rote because they're using a Spanish system. And so we get different behavior adjacent to uvulars, and this can be traced in the interest of, this can be traced instrumentally this shows you basically the this is a Quechua I, and adjacent to a uvular, it's just pulled back, and there's a Quechua U adjacent to a uvular. It's also pulled back. It's lowered ever so slightly in this plot of vowels. So you can actually identify the social position of speakers from the ways they're pronouncing their vowels. Now, one of the consequences of this, and again, I'm going to skip over, I want to just acknowledge the researchers who've worked in this before me and who identified this, and there are 4 people who've worked on this. The most important research on this, I think, is by Jorge Ivan Perez, a US-trained Peruvian linguist who's done a great deal of instrumental work on this all and has published on that. And he did it in a completely, I'm going to do a description of this. I'm not going to tell you how this works socially. So then Margarita Waiwa, one of our PhDs in anthropology, took his description and tested this in a community, and I'll get to that in a second. So we have a phonological feature, one of several that can serve as an index of what register somebody is speaking, and and I've summarized this here. I've summarized what I just told you, but we then have 3 different patterns of accommodation of vowels to uvulars. A description in terms of monolingual Quechua speakers falsifies the speech of Quechua speakers who are learning Spanish or of first language Spanish speakers who've learned Quechua. A description in terms of the second group, the monolingual Quechua speakers who've learned Spanish, which is, by the way, normally what we'll find in the best of grammatical descriptions. It's the one that has vowel lowering in it, falsifies the speech of monolinguals and is false with respect to the speech of monolinguals, and is false with respect to Spanish dominant bilinguals. And a description in terms of the third pattern, which is the description one finds in most pedagogical grammars, is false with respect to the speech of all first language Quechua speakers. And so along with this, the vowel pattern is a shibboleth of a very charged and racialized set of social distinctions. And speakers react emotionally to any description whatsoever that doesn't fit their own variety of Quechua. So the next slides, we're going through the evidence for that very briefly, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about why this system came into being, where you have 3 different registers that are different from each other phonologically, syntactically, semantically, and pragmatically. And it works as follows, that colonial demographics were such that although Peru was a settler society, most of the settlers from Spain ended up on the coast rather than in the highlands. In the highlands, you mainly had landowners who were granted estates, their overseers, soldiers, and priests. And those were the primary populations of Spanish speakers, and they were actually quite small in number, so there was no way that the Spanish speakers could impose their own speech on Quechua speakers demographically. And the system of landed estates there required Spanish speakers to speak Quechua. And what gradually happened is they, not so gradually even, they spoke Quechua to each other, but they spoke a Hispanized version of Quechua to each other. Until 1976, the region was dominated by an economy of landed estates. And Quechua speakers were bound to the estates. In some cases, they were branded. They were forced. We have sanitized ways of talking about them. We call them workers on haciendas. They were effectively slaves. And there was a second system of slavery, not one that depended on sale of individuals and bondage of individuals, but rather bondage of entire households that form parts of these estates. The economy of landed estates lasted until a military government in 1976 decreed an end to the system and enforced the end to the system as well. Because it was a military government that could actually enforce it. In addition, there was no rural education whatsoever on these estates. During this period, this goes all the way from 1534, when Cusco was settled, to when the highlands were settled in general by the Spaniards, to 1976. Spanish basically was used as a written administrative language, and that creates a mirage, because if you're doing history, you're working with documents written in Spanish, and your assumption is that the spoken language was like that, and that turns out to be false. There's a fair amount of evidence for that, and I have samples that start in the late 17th century, in the 1600s, and then go to the early part of the 20th century to support that. Mainly travelers' reports and a couple of very precise local descriptions. Now, the register system in the highlands is very specific to the highlands, and if I go back to that map, you'll see it's the area that's darkest in the map in terms of concentration of Quechua and Aymara speakers. And on the coast, there's a very different history to the relationship between the languages. And there's really no time to talk about it now, but the major point I want to make here is that the contemporary situation is very, very different from the one I'm describing. We had the abolition of the estate system and of estate slavery or peonage in the 1970s, and also the creation of a rural primary education system. But it was an education system constructed entirely in Spanish. And so as a part of that, a secondary system of elementary bilingual education was set up, and although rhetorically they claim it's not this, it's essentially there to transition Quechua-speaking children into speaking Spanish, and it's available primarily in the early grades, and the teachers themselves are teachers who speak the overlay to children who may completely misunderstand what their instructors are saying. So I want to end by talking about what is to be done, and I'm going to take about 2 more minutes to do that as a result. So the first thing to tell you all is that almost all the grammatical research that's been done on Quechua, which is already very little, has been mediated through the overlay, and has been done often with native speaker informants, I'm going to put them in air quotes, who are speakers of the overlay and not with real first language speakers of Quechua. So just from the standpoint of linguistics, we need serious linguistically grounded analyses of the language of Register 1 speakers, of monolinguals, particularly constructed around issues in syntax, pragmatics, and frame of reference. And I can explain in the conversation why those in the conversation afterwards. It also has to be naturalistic. It has to be ethnographically grounded, because an across-the-table elicitation will automatically get you something that looks like the overlay. We need ethnography that meets the needs and aims of communities today. There's a crisis of confidence in rural communities in the reproduction of both language and culture. And I want to give you one example of a successful endeavor that was prompted by the crisis of confidence. A graduate student of ours, Georgia Ennis, has been doing research in a community called Tena in the Ecuadorian lowlands, and the Association of midwives of the West, Quechua midwives of the Western Amazon asked her to please do some ethnography for them. And what they wanted was they wanted her to systematically interview people about their interactions with the forest, because they thought that was the essential knowledge that was in danger of being lost across generations. She set up teams of teenagers who were Quechua speakers but didn't have this knowledge to interview their parents and grandparents. All of this was videotaped that collected lots and lots of stories. She transcribed them in Quechua. She set up a system of presentation of the stories in a line structure, and then did a translation herself into English first and then into Spanish. And the whole project in the end was published as a book that's available only in Tena, Ecuador, but was funded by the Ecuadorian Ministry of Culture. And it's a very small step to work on behalf of the community, of a community of speakers, and to address their perceived needs. I've been contacted by another community in the South asking, could I work with them in constructing an ethnographic monograph of their community. It's a community that's well known. It's been described ethnographically 3 or 4 times from the perspective often of elites, from local elites, and from the perspective of the family of the former landowners in the area. And there have been about 5 movies made of them. Do they need a description of their everyday lives? Well, they feel they do, and they feel that it's important that it be in Quechua. So these are very similar kinds of proposals from two geographically quite distant points about 2,000 miles away from each other. And that suggests that the anxiety is possibly more widespread, but it also gives us a kind of a model for the kinds of research we need to be supporting ethnographically. So I'm going to stop there. There's some large-scale desiderata that I can get to afterwards. So.
Thank you, Professor Mannheim. Our next speaker is Professor Martin Vega of Scripps College. Dr. Vega is a proud Wolverine for having received his PhD from the University of Michigan. His research examines that fascinating intersection between race, class, and gender, exemplified by his recent writing on indigenous women governors, I assume they call cacicas, in colonial Mexico. Dr. Vega, I should add, belongs to that venerable tradition of Latin Americanists who have learned both Quechua and Nahuatl. His talk today is titled False Promises and the Perseverance of Mexico's Indigenous Languages.
So thank you for that introduction, Howard. I want to thank everyone in the audience for being here today, and a special thanks to Howard and the Center for the International Center for putting on this conference and bringing into focus the urgent issues of language endangerment, preservation, and revitalization. So to repeat some of the information that has been presented earlier, a recent statement from the Endangered Languages Project informs us that of the nearly 7,000 languages in the world today, some 3,000 or 43% are endangered, and in the worst case scenario, 90% of all languages will be extinct within 100 years. In the best case scenario, only 50% will survive. The reduction in linguistic diversity is an outcome of the same global economic processes that are rapidly deteriorating the planet's biodiversity. Capitalist interventions in the form of large-scale natural resource extraction and the dispossession of traditionally native lands are foremost vehicles in the reduction of the world's cultural and biological diversity. Indigenous communities, in turn, are at the front lines fighting against those incursions. For it is their lifeways, their existence, that are in most immediate danger of extinction. The fight for linguistic preservation is inextricable from this larger conflict. And when I say conflict, I mean low-intensity warfare that's being carried out by the state, whether in the US, India, Mexico, or Peru, in the name of global capitalist interests. In the Americas, this conflict is the legacy of European colonization dating to the 16th century. In this talk, I'll focus on the indigenous language of Mexico, the indigenous languages of Mexico, and specifically Nahuatl, a language that I began studying here at the University of Michigan in 2010, and that has in the last 3 decades been the focus of concerted revitalization efforts in Mexico, the US, and in Europe. This map shows the regions in Mesoamerica where Nahuatl is currently spoken. According to the last Mexican census in 2010, there were 1,544,968 people aged 5 years and over who spoke Nahuatl, making it far and away the most commonly spoken indigenous language in Mexico. The National Institute of Indigenous Languages, or INALI, recognizes 68 indigenous languages currently spoken in Mexico, 63 of which are native to Mexico. These languages are further divided into 350 dialects. Nahuatl alone includes 30 dialects such as the Nahuatl of the Lower Isthmus, Nahuatl of Oaxaca, and the Nahuatl of the Huastec region of Veracruz, which is the variant that I have studied. Since the 1970s, the population of indigenous language speakers in Mexico has doubled, from about 3 million to between 6 million and 7 million. Yet since the 1930s, the percentage of the Mexican population that speaks indigenous languages has dropped from a little over 15% to 6.6%. The Endangered Languages Project has labeled Nahuatl as a vulnerable language. As seen in this map, virtually all of Mexico's indigenous languages are at risk, marked by green dots, in danger of extinction, marked by yellow dots, or in grave danger of extinction, marked by red dots. And it is no coincidence that the large majority of indigenous communities in Mexico's southern states, which are also the country's most biodiverse regions. The endangerment of Mexico's indigenous languages, I argue, is a colonial legacy, the product of 500 years of Hispanic modernity imposed on Native American populations. Only since 1917 has the Mexican government recognized the linguistic rights of indigenous communities. The survival of Nahuatl and the insistence of speaking it today constitutes a political act that defies the historical effort to reduce linguistic diversity under the sign of the Christian cross, mestizo nationalism, and global capitalism. For this reason, I want to suggest that dialect diversity is itself a sign of linguistic vitality. From that vantage point, the perseverance of Nahuatl owes more to its dialect variants than to the intermittent efforts to standardize it, using any combination of the Latin-Spanish alphabet. In my talk, I'll trace a brief genealogy of language politics in Mexico through the lens of Nahuatl, from the colonial period to the Republican period, focusing specifically on the constitutional treatment of indigenous languages as a symptom of the Mexican state's institutional ambivalence towards linguistic difference and preservation. I ask finally whether the drive to standardize is not perhaps part and parcel of a statist project that is marked by this ambivalence. In August of 1521, the Mexica, or Aztec, capital of Tenochtitlan, fell to the invading Spanish army, marking the beginnings of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico. Beginning in 1524, the arrival of the Franciscan Order of Catholic Friars to Mexico catalyzed a decades-long project of linguistic conversion, or transliterating Nahuatl, the language of the Imperial Mexica, into the Spanish Latin alphabet. That project prompted the training of Catholic clergymen in Nahuatl, many of whom acquired fluency in the language. In his study on the spiritual conquest of Mexico, Robert Ricard found 109 grammars of indigenous languages produced in Mexico between 1524 and 1572. These texts are a product of deep linguistic study by both friars and their indigenous collaborators, for the project could never have been completed so thoroughly and quickly without the aid of indigenous intellectuals. These texts are also a product of colonial hegemony created to facilitate the Catholic evangelical mission. Despite massive losses of life among indigenous communities due to European-derived diseases and forced labor in the first century of colonial rule, indigenous communities were still the overwhelming majority population in Mexico entering the beginning of the 16th century, the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th century. As colonial settlers, Catholic friars understood the need to speak indigenous languages in order to convey the word of the Christian God in their sermons to their indigenous congregations. I want to dwell on this particular term, congregation. In the first century of colonial rule in Mexico, Catholic congregations did not form organically, but rather through the forced relocation of indigenous communities, often of different ethnic groups and speaking different languages, into Spanish-style cities organized around a temple. Another name for congregación, congregation, elsewhere in Latin America and places like the Caribbean and Peru was reducción, or reduction. The logic of congregation/reduction was to reduce or concentrate disparate and dispersed indigenous communities into manageable units. Spatial reduction, as Professor Daniel Nemser here at U of M has argued, operated alongside linguistic reduction in colonial Mexico. Linguistic variants, like spatial dispersion, presented an obstacle to the surveillance and evangelization of the indigenous community. Priests like Rodrigo de la Cruz thus proposed a project of linguistic reduction that privileged Nahuatl as a universal indigenous language in Mesoamerica. On May 4th, 1550, de la Cruz wrote to the Spanish monarch, Charles V, recommending that all the Indians learn the Mexican, that is Nahuatl, language. For in every village today, there are many Indians who know it and learn it easily, a very great number who confess in that language. It is an extremely elegant language, as elegant as any in the world. A grammar and dictionary of it have been written, and many parts of the Holy Scriptures have been translated into it. Many collections of sermons have been made, and some religious have mastered it completely. In de la Cruz's recommendations, we see a celebration of the mastery over Nahuatl, and with this, a drive to make it a standard language across the multilingual landscape of indigenous Mesoamerica. The initial privileging and dispersion of Nahuatl under colonialism thus accompanies the logic of linguistic reduction. The logic of reduction, however, also contributed to the eventual displacement of Nahuatl in favor of Spanish. In the first century of Spanish colonial rule, from 1521 to the early 16th century, Nahuatl was a critical language in day-to-day interactions and commerce. Robert Schwaller notes, for example, that many mestizos and mulattoes spoke both Spanish and Nahuatl, just as many Spanish-speaking indigenous people called Ladinos were also multilingual. In fact, the colonial government initially aspired to a dual republic model, establishing a republic of the Spaniards and a republic of the Indians. Yet, as Maria Elena Martinez argued in her book Genealogical Fictions, the promise of autonomous indigenous governments went unrealized as mestizo and Creole elites monopolized government offices. Over the remainder of the colonial period, from the 16th to 19th centuries, the status of Nahuatl waned with the continued growth of a mixed-race population and the increased marginalization of indigenous communities. By the 17th century, writing in Nahuatl was limited to lower level notaries working in communities where Nahuatl remained the dominant language. The decline in Nahuatl status corresponds with the entrenchment of Spanish as the language of official business and educated society. By the time of independence in the early 19th century, Nahuatl and all other indigenous languages in Mexico were markers of racial inferiority, the languages of the indios, whose destiny was to serve as surplus labor in the haciendas, or plantations, of the white Creole elite. In her study of indigenous education in Mexico's early Republican period, Pilar Gonzalo Aispuru dispels the myth that the education of indigenous people was of no importance to the Spanish crown and colonial authorities. But what she emphasizes is the specifically Christian character of the education provided to the indigenous population, even in the most remote regions. Education in this sense was a tool for acclimating the indigenous population in Spanish policía, or good governance, which is to say, a Spanish idea of civility, and thus civilization. In the passage to a national republic after independence, education in Mexico took up a secular character and yet amplified the racial prejudices developed in the colonial period. As in other newly formed Latin American republics, the indigenous population became the Indian problem, an obstacle to the progress of the liberal nation state. Liberal officials in Mexico like José María Luis Mora, for example, denigrated the intellect of indigenous people, stating that the Indian commonly lacks imagination even when he comes to acquire a certain degree of culture. As Ann Staples argues, the idea of a liberal education founded on the Enlightenment principle of equality was, for Mexico's indigenous population, a false promise. Indeed, in the first century after independence, the indigenous population and its languages were virtually erased from the imagined community of the secular nation. This is particularly evident in the Mexican constitutions of 1824 and 1857, to which I'll turn my attention now. Whereas the colonial government aspired to a dual republic model for Spanish and indigenous communities, the new republican government formed in the 19th century aspired to one republic and tacitly one national language, Spanish. The first Constitution of the Mexican United States, ratified in 1824, references the indigenous population only once in Section 5 of the Faculties of the General Congress, stating that the General Congress will regulate the commerce with foreign nations and among the different states and tribes of Indians. The Mexican Constitution of 1857, in turn, eliminates this section altogether, leaving only a clause that affords to the Congress the power to dictate laws on naturalization, colonization, and citizenship. From here on, the indigenous population becomes a problem for the national republican state, an unassimilable, uncivilized multitude, or a subaltern class, to use the terms of Antonio Gramsci. The 1857 laws, followed by reforms in the 1860s, represented victory for liberal politicians intent on expanding a capitalist economy in Mexico and burying the remnants of monarchic governance, including the paternalistic protections of the indigenous population that had existed under the Spanish crown. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution brought to the forefront the injustices borne by indigenous and rural campesino communities in the first century of republican governance. The 1917 Constitution is often referenced for the creation of commonly held agricultural lands and the fractioning of the hacienda economy, in Article 27 specifically. The distribution of land brings to focus the imbrication of the Indian problem and the economy of indentured servitude on which the large hacienda estates subsisted, as José Carlos Mariátegui argued a decade later in Peru. Yet along with land reform, the 1917 Mexican Constitution, which prevails today, also affords to indigenous communities linguistic and educational rights. Specifically, Article 2 of the 1917 Constitution grants autonomy to indigenous communities so that they can preserve and enrich their languages, knowledge, and all the elements that constitute their culture and identity. The instantiation of language rights accompanies the guarantee of a bilingual and cross-cultural education and related government support in the form of a scholarship system and regional education programs. These constitutional guarantees provided the impulse for the establishment of a system of normal rural schools, which grew from 16 in 1931 to 40 a decade later. Schools such as the Normal Rural School of Ayotzinapa, founded in 1926, would train teachers from Mexico's rural agricultural communities so that they could, in theory, return to those communities as agents of the bilingual, cross-cultural education promised in the 1917 Constitution. The promise of educational access formed part of a larger indigenista movement that, steered by state officials, reimagined the Mexican nation as both rooted in its indigenous population and an example of mestizaje, or as Jose Vasconcelos put it, la raza cósmica, the cosmic race. In this vein, Article 2 of the 1917 Constitution deems the Mexican nation to be pluricultural and based originally on its indigenous population. Diego Rivera's murals, many of them depicting indigenous people, like the Nahua woman Doña Luz Jimenez, became emblematic of this turn to indigenismo and pluriculturalism. Yet the affirmation of pluriculturalism stands in paradoxical relation to the continued insistence on a singular nation imagined fundamentally as mestizo and Christian. In fact, Article 2 opens with the statement that la nación mexicana es única e indivisible. The Mexican nation is one and indivisible. The insistence on a nation that is one and indivisible allows for a cultural program of indigenismo while funneling ethnic difference into the vacuum of mestizaje, which, as critics have remarked, whitewashes indigeneity out of the body politic. Article 2 thus exemplifies an original ambivalence in Mexican attitudes towards the indigenous population. The promise of educational access quickly dissipated with the entrenchment of an increasingly authoritarian right-wing government led by the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Thus, while the number of rural normal schools in Mexico grew from in the 1930s and 40s, the schools have continually suffered from insufficient financial and infrastructural resources, and their commitment to the redistributive ideals of the Mexican Revolution has made them a consistent target of state violence to the present day. Of the 29 schools that remained open on the eve of the 1968 massacre of student activists in Tlatelolco in Mexico City, 15 were closed immediately after. The disappearance of 43 students from the Rural Normal School of Ayotzinapa in September 2014 is a reminder of the continued intolerance for indigenous and rural communities that insist on asserting their rights to an education on their terms rather than on terms dictated by a central government increasingly intent on modernizing education. And today, modernization means following the footsteps of the United States and privatizing education, making it a profit-driven enterprise. Since their establishment then, the normal rural schools geared towards the needs of indigenous and rural communities have been under attack. And when indigenous children make their way into the mainstream educational system in Mexico, they are often chastised for speaking their mother tongues, which are deemed useless in a global economy. They are told to speak in Castellano and Castilian, or como buen cristiano, like a good Christian. They are also physically assaulted by classmates and teachers for speaking their language. And such actions are the colonial legacy of a Hispanic modernity carried out in the most mundane interactions. Recognizing the unfulfilled promises of the 1917 Constitution, on March 13, 2003, the government of Vicente Fox issued a new law on linguistic rights for indigenous people. The 2003 law mandates the diffusion of indigenous languages in programs of education, in government correspondence, and in media outlets. It also mandates that teachers working in intercultural programs in indigenous communities write and speak in indigenous languages. The National Institute of Indigenous Languages, for example, was formed as a result of the 2003 law. Yet, as John Sullivan has commented, reflecting on his experiences organizing a Nahuatl research group in Mexico in the 90s and 2000s, it does not matter what the Mexican Constitution says if one of the goals of Mexican society and its institutions is to erase indigenous languages and cultures from the face of the earth. Programs like those initiated by Sullivan in collaboration with indigenous researchers and teachers, on the other hand, push against and through official ambivalence toward indigenous languages and a broader intolerance toward them rooted in colonial hierarchies of race. In the last part of my talk, then, I want to turn to some examples of Nahuatl's perseverance and vitality in the face of historic censure and censorship of indigenous languages in Mexico. The wide dialect variance of the language, I argue, is a critical part of that vitality. While I understand the gesture involved in the idea of language revitalization, I also want to emphasize that Nahuatl and the other 67 officially recognized indigenous languages spoken in Mexico today are alive, even as they are all endangered and some on the verge of extinction. In this vein, at least in the case of Nahuatl, it may be more appropriate to speak of language perseverance, since native Nahuatl speakers have persevered through 5 centuries of linguistic, racial, and economic marginalization. And to echo the impressions of the colonial Franciscan friar Rodrigo de la Cruz, cited earlier in this talk, it is an extremely elegant language. One, moreover, that has adapted to the imposition of Spanish while also incorporating its vocabulary into a global vernacular. Nahuatl has gifted the world with the words chocolate or chocolate from chocolat, bitter water, ajolote from axolot, water monster, and avocado or aguacate from aguacat, this last being a possible loan from the Totonac word pawat. Nahuatl is a language of those who have resisted the harshest elements of evangelization, liberal style modernization, and the current dictates of global finance capitalism. In this vein, dialect variety stands in opposition to the logic of linguistic reduction that is quickly intensifying. Thus, when the 17th century Nahuatl historian Timapan Cuatlewanitzi wrote a compendium of histories in his native language, he emphasized the necessity of preserving the memory of his ancestors precisely against the work of congregation or reduction, those fractioning local indigenous communities. His incorporation of Spanish terms for governance and justice illustrates the grammatical and conceptual flexibility of Nahuatl in the face of colonialism. Even after Chimalpain, generations of indigenous scribes in the colonial period continued to record such mundane matters as testimonial wills in their native language. And yet, standard literature, our idea of what constitutes literature, is only one of many expressive realms in which Nahuatl persists. And along with literature, I want to add the concept of literacy, which is just as often a tool of discrimination as it is a tool of social advancement. Nahuatl persists first and foremost because of its relevance in Mexico's rural communities, where it has developed a vocabulary for the specific flora, fauna, topography, and climate regions like the Huasteca and the state of Veracruz. Nahuatl persists in the performance of community celebrations such as the festivities of Elotlamanalisli, which means the corn ears appear. Celebrations like Elotlamanalisli are contemporary ciphers of pre-Hispanic celebrations like Tososli. And if we are to speak of literature more traditionally, it's worth noting that the contemporary Nahuatl story of Chicomechochit, an oral legend revolving around the adventures of a young corn god, bears a striking resemblance to the adventures of the twin corn deities recorded in the Mayan text known as the Popol Vuh, which itself is a compendium of Quiche oral histories recorded in the Spanish-Latin alphabet in the 16th century. The continuity of this story between languages and dialects speaks to the cultural vitality of diverse indigenous communities like those in the Huasteca. Today, there are Nahuatl language programs in Mexico and the US, among them Nahuacana and the Zacatecas Institute for Research on Teaching and Ethnology. In recent years, universities like the University of Michigan and UT Austin have offered Nahuatl courses with native speaking instructors for credit. In Southern California, there are informal groups of Nahuatl learners like the one led by John Garcia, who has translated Mary Shelley's Frankenstein into Nahuatl and created an animated version of the Chicomechochit legend. There is rap in Nahuatl, and there have been operas and movies in Nahuatl. There's Sesame Street in Nahuatl. And all of this is possible because of the intellectual work of native Nahuatl speakers as teachers and researchers who have held on to the language throughout and despite their schooling. I teach Nahuatl in my Spanish courses because it enriches what my students learn about Latin American culture and history and creates potential circuits of solidarity with indigenous communities. And while I and many other US and Europe-based students of Nahuatl have learned one variant in particular, that of the Huasteca in Veracruz, this is only one of many dialects that only recently have been shown to be more mutually intelligible than previously thought, and that brought together could broaden our vocabulary and grammatical understanding of Nahuatl. There is still much comparative research to be done on Amerindian languages across the hemisphere. To conclude, I want to suggest a view toward dialect diversity as a source of linguistic perseverance against the tendency to standardize, whether in the reliance on one variant or the insistence of one system of writing. Justifiably, a recent proposal for a novel Nahuatl syllabary provoked impassioned responses on social media about cultural appropriation and linguistic change. Today, there's no standard written Nahuatl, no Royal Academy of Nahuatl mediating such discussions. But in the absence of a certain institutional inertia, I propose that there is strength and flexibility for Nahuatl to persist and persevere as a living spoken language. And this may mean reorienting the way we perceive literacy, literature, culture, and education in a way that recognizes the beauty of indigenous languages and the range of cultural expression. Thank you.
Martin, it's very nice to see you. I have a question for you. I liked what you mentioned in your talk about the idea of not unifying Nahuatl. There's all these different varieties of Nahuatl. But I wanted to ask you, I was thinking, looking at the map, and you look at Nahuatl down in the isthmus, like Pipil, and I don't even know how many speakers of that variety still remain, but I imagine it's a fairly small number. And that, to my knowledge, which is quite limited, the Pipil variety is quite different than many other, say the Huasteca variety, which we are familiar with. And so I'm just wondering and thinking in my mind, and I'm sure I'll be continuing to think about this after this conference is over, how there's strength in numbers, right? So from one perspective, one might argue, oh, well, we should unify Nahuatl because that gives us a larger population. We should have a standardized version, a standardized writing system, blah, blah, blah. And then you're arguing, exactly, don't do that. That's really interesting to me. I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think this is something that you know firsthand when I mentioned that there was a proposal to create a new writing system in Nahuatl. This is actually the person who proposed that, Ed Traeger. It was interesting to see the responses to that writing system. It was one that we could say was based on different languages, but represented the sounds of Nahuatl. The Spanish orthographical system, we could say, is not, in linguistic terms, an efficient or economic way to represent Nahuatl. So that's the first problem. That's the first problem to begin with in terms of standardization. For anyone who has ever proposed, and there have been different proposals to standardize Nahuatl, that's the first obstacle, is that the Spanish alphabet does not do a good job of representing certain sounds, which is why you get certain words like Tecutli, which means Lord in Nahuatl, but is actually pronounced Tecli, or Tecli. So that's based on certain dialects of Nahuatl. There have been encuentros, or meetings recently, only just recently in the past decade, of Nahuatl speakers from different regions who speak different dialects And before that, it was presumed that these dialects were not mutually intelligible. In fact, they are. And so what that tells us is that even across different writing systems, they might very well still be intelligible. At the same time, a lot of indigenous communities have been categorized as illiterate, right? But that also implies certain ideas about what literacy is. So I think that's another obstacle that Nahuatl would face. If there were some kind of proposal to standardize the languages, I don't know if it would ever conform to what traditionally, historically, have been the standards for literacy, right? Partly because it doesn't fit into Spanish orthography. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, not completely, but I think it's just, there's a lot of things to consider, because beyond the orthographic standardization or that was just one thing. That was like, I did this exercise for my own benefit, and then, yes, as you mentioned, it got quite a very impressive response when I put it out there on Facebook, actually, and then, but that's only one aspect, because beyond that, because if I understood you correctly, what you're suggesting is there are these varietal differences in the way people speak, and I agree. I actually agree. I think it probably is a good idea to preserve those differences, but how does one preserve those differences? I guess that's the question. How do you preserve differences in the way people speak a language? This is just spoken language, right? We could have, if you think about, like, say, Arabic, for example, maybe that's a case where you've got different varieties of Arabic spoken across the world, but there's modern standard Arabic is a single thing. So people all over the world can read a single written kind of, it's a register of the language that sort of exists in places. Maybe that's something that will happen. And maybe it'll develop like organically over time if Nahuatl persists for the next 100 years, So, yeah.
If I can ask that question from the other side, is not a process of standardization somehow happening when you say there's Sesame Street in Nahuatl, there's operas being performed in Nahuatl? Are they being performed in the same variety of Nahuatl? And so even as you promote the flexibility and the support for all these variants, is there sort of a movement towards one version over others?
It depends on who's doing the project and whom they're working with. So, for example, the people who work on Sesame Street might be working with native speakers from one region, whereas the people working on, say, the Frankenstein book are working with speakers from another region. I think actually there needs to be more work done on this question. And part of it needs to be about not just orally are these languages mutually intelligible, but let's say also in terms of reading, but then you come up against this barrier, which is a lot of first register speakers haven't grown up writing in Nahuatl or reading in Nahuatl, and a lot of texts are being produced by, in some cases, Nahuatl learners. So that work needs to be done, really. There needs to be a documentation of which variants are being used in these different cultural productions, which are starting to become more frequent. Who's doing them, with whom, where the Nahuatl speakers coming from, what is the kind of training that the people, if they're not native speakers, what kind of training do they have in Nahuatl? that's some research that needs to be done.
So let me add a comment, and then we can bring in the Quechua case. So let me
Okay.
exercise my tyrannical role as a moderator. It's interesting, the issue about standardization, but I just want to bring on the point that standardized languages are actually a very, very recent phenomenon in a long arc of human history or human prehistory. So we actually don't know what's the longevity of a standardized language. We do know the longevity of the diversity of languages because they've been here for so long. So the experiment with a standard language, we actually don't know how long they could last and what is the long-term effects of standardizing a language.
Let me come at it from a different angle. And I particularly want to address myself to people who don't work in Latin America here, because we mean something very specific by a standard language that isn't what was meant, for example, in the process of standardization of Czech between the two world wars, or Bahasa Indonesia after Indonesian independence, or modern Hebrew, all of which were fairly comprehensive standardization programs that involved attention to syntax, to using older literary works in some cases, and so forth. And there are processes of standardization that understood a standard language to be multifunctional, to be used in a variety of different kinds of situations, to be used in some cases by the state for bureaucratic purposes, and so forth. When we talk about standardization in Latin America, and more so in South America than in Central Mexico or in Mesoamerica, we're talking about an orthography for the language and nothing else. So when people argue about standardization, they're arguing about how to write the language. It's a very, very basic phenomenon. It really doesn't address issues of standardization at all. So the question of whether it increases diversity or reduces diversity is largely moot. What it does do in some cases is it signals a particular political allegiance by people who can enforce one particular writing system over another, and it can also introduce a specific class allegiance. In the case of Quechua, it's the class allegiance. In the case of Guatemala, where there are multiple orthographic movements around, in quotes now, standardizing Mayan languages, it was mainly a political issue that involved a dispute between Wycliffe Bible translators and Mayan scholars and Mayan communities as three different poles. But that's so. When we're talking about so I wanted to address a different point made by one of the questioners. We, notice the pronoun, do not encourage linguistic diversity. We, notice the pronoun again, do not reduce linguistic diversity by our actions. First language speakers of the languages in question do both.
I have a microphone here.
Oh.
Okay, I have a microphone, I'm prepared to use it. Okay, I say, and then, is this thing on? No. Is this thing, okay, now it's on. Okay, so first a disclaimer, because I am a medievalist and also a literary historian, and so I'm going to be kind of like speaking a different language from you all, literally and metaphorically. But I'm curious about this question of language standardization because, of course, like, we know that I work on many examples of standardized languages, including Latin and Arabic, and even kind of, the written languages of Europe had to go through a process of standardization before they became such, before they became written languages. And we know that there was this kind of like, there was a vibrant kind of biosphere of spoken languages that existed kind of off the edge of the page, but it's very difficult to capture. It's very difficult to recreate. And we know that also. I'm curious. I want to push back a little bit against this idea of seeing languages and the biosphere, linguistic diversity and biodiversity as being kind of parallel things, same things. I mean, really, you're using a metaphor there to describe language behavior, and to kind of capture language actualities, which does not. It's a metaphor. In some ways, it matches, and in some ways, it doesn't. Right? Because languages are not organic beings. They don't, reproduce sexually. They don't have mixed seeds. They don't, they interact and they evolve. They change historically in different ways. Languages are complex adaptive systems, really, in a sense, more than they are organic beings, And I think that, like, what you're describing in the material, both of you, the material that you presented, which was, very rich and really interesting, I caught lots of glimpses of emergent languages. As much as language is going away, I saw languages emerging, coming into being, right? And it comes through. You don't have to be an L1 speaker, or I don't even know like I said, I don't even know your terminology. You don't have to be a monolingual speaker in order to manipulate a language. We have plenty of examples. Again. From the examples of standardized languages, of people coming in from the outside and producing, in some ways very productive and interesting changes in languages. And I saw some of that happening in the material that you were presenting. I mean, isn't this just, isn't this? I think, probably what you're seeing happening is what happened in my the medieval world that I study. Again, off the edge of the page and out of the sight of modern historians. I guess that's that you could say no, disagree with me, and make that into a question.
Well, I think we are working in some sense in a transition from, you could say, the medieval period to the early modern period, and the role that either language standardization or the creation of grammars is, we could say, maybe one hallmark of the transition to early modernity, or the creation of vernacular languages. At least in the case of Mexico, in some ways, there was more interest in standardizing Nahuatl than there was in having some kind of standard Spanish.
That's right.
So I think in a sense, you're right in that, well, there was a certain, let's say, engineering going on, linguistic engineering happening with this contact between languages, which, as some critics of translation have said, is always a colonial encounter. Any kind of contact between languages is in some ways colonial. And I guess, for the person who focuses more on the medieval period, I would ask to what extent maybe that's true. There were colonial linguistic relations already going on, and that might have shaped the way Europeans oriented themselves towards Amerindian languages.
So I'd like to take advantage of my role as well, Howard. I have a question for you, Martin, from our United Nations partners. How might dialectical variances in Mexico's indigenous languages be most effectively integrated into mainstream educational courses and programs? And quite relatedly, which differential special circumstances should one pay attention to in such integration processes? Thank you.
The educational domain is one of the areas where historically people are able to preserve or revitalize languages, for better or worse. It's one of the important domains for linguistic preservation or revitalization. There needs to be, I mean, I hate to be too prescriptive, but respect for, let's say, alternative literacies, alternative forms of expression. A language like Nahuatl, at least, I mean, there is the question of how much is it related to, let's say, natural phenomena or the biosphere. But Nahuatl has developed in certain regions in relationship to the land that it describes. Or, for example, in Nahuatl, there are directional suffixes that don't quite translate into Spanish that indicate whether someone's going somewhere, how long they're going to go, or whether they're going to come right back. So I think, first of all, any educational system has to respond or be attentive or adapt to the forms of expression that already exist in individual communities. And that includes the way they do agriculture. It includes the way they perceive natural phenomena or meteorological phenomena. But that also means respecting their use of the land, their use of their own land traditionally. So.
У меня есть вопрос, но он не касается, наверное, темы выступления, немножко другой, ученый.
Pavel says, I have a question. It may not be related specifically to your topics, but I'd like to ask you as linguists.
Знаете, я в свое время был учителем школы в своей родной общине, потом стал руководителем общины всей, потом вот 2 срока, 6 лет был членом постоянного форума ООН по коренным народам Нью-Йорка.
So in my day, back in my home community, I was a teacher for a while, and then I became the head of my tribal association, and then I served two terms at the UN, at the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples.
Я вот 2 срока, 6 лет был в рабочей группе ООН по бизнесу и правам человека.
And served 2 6-year terms on the UN Committee for Human Rights.
Сам я занимаюсь тоже научными исследованиями, наукой.
I also do research.
И у меня есть вот некоторые вот соображения, и потом я задам вопрос.
And I have a couple of thoughts if we have time for it, and then I have a question.
Знаете, меня на самом деле всегда пугает, когда кто-то, общество, например, ООН, да, объявляет какую-то кампанию.
He says, I'm always a little nervous when the UN starts some sort of new campaign.
Например, вот 19-й год объявили годом коренных народов.
For example, next year being the Year of Indigenous Languages.
И я просто знаю, например, да, что Российская Федерация к этому году готовится как пропагандистская кампания.
And I know that in Russia, for example, it's being prepared for by the Russian government as a propaganda campaign.
При этом в Российской Федерации принимаются законы, в этом году были приняты поправки к законам, которые урезают возможность изучать родные языки народам России.
And on the other hand, the Russian government this year, in 2018, has passed new laws essentially greatly hindering indigenous language instruction and study.
Я в своем выступлении говорил, что теперь угроза изучения своих языков не только для коренных малочисленных народов, но и для больших коренных народов, татар, башкир, там, алтайцев и так далее.
And so there's now a new threat, not just to these small-numbered minority peoples, but also to the large titular nations inside of Russia, the Bashkirs, the Tatars, Altaians, so forth.
При этом я, конечно, так как я уважаю ООН, да, я в структурах ООН очень тесно работаю, но я считаю, что к этому нужно относиться достаточно философски.
And so, of course, having worked for many years involved in the UN, and I respect them, I also would encourage a certain degree of skepticism and caution.
Тем более мы должны хорошо понимать, что ООН это все-таки управляется правительством.
And of course, we have to remember that the UN is essentially a governing organization.
А у меня вопрос такой. Вы, вот как ученый, да, очень много работаете с вопросами, связанными с языками коренных народов. Как вы думаете, да, что мне кажется, что вот именно ученые, те, кто занимается этим, у них есть разные рецепты сохранения и развития.
Сохранение и развитие. Да. And so my question is to you as you know, language experts is what are sort of the recipes, the methods for preserving the development of languages?
Например, да, что, к огромному сожалению, многие научные исследования, в том числе по языкам коренных народов, они остаются в воздухе, то есть как научная работа без приложения практического.
For example, you know, there's a great body of research and writing that's been done for indigenous languages, but it remains hanging in the air, that there's no applied use of it.
И поэтому мне кажется, вот было бы очень важно, если бы, я понимаю, что это, наверное, дополнительная нагрузка для ученых, да, но мне кажется, все-таки было бы важно, если бы ученые, в том числе, помимо своих научных целей, в своих работах ставили и практическую часть.
And so I understand it's a lot to ask and that you already have a lot to do, but it would be great if you as scholars would also take on at least some attempt to try and find more applied uses for the work that you do. That's very important.
Как представитель коренных народов, я могу сказать, и как ученый тоже, что мы все равно всегда ждем, да, от ученых определенной конкретной практической помощи.
And so I, as an indigenous person and somebody who's been in contact with scholars over the years, that we're always waiting for some sort of application and more practical use of the research.
И у меня вопрос вот такого плана. Например, мы в своей работе вообще решали такие задачи, мы всегда делали таким образом, что ученые занимаются наукой, занимаются разработкой предложений, а есть еще неправительственные организации, которые являются между учеными и нами, да, теми структурами, которые могли бы решать практические части, как внедрить то, что разрабатывают ученые.
And so, in our experience in the Udige community, that in addition to the indigenous peoples and the scholars that work on our that study us, that there also needs to be a connection, and usually through the form of an NGO, a nonprofit organization that can create that connection and find ways of applying the knowledge.
Здесь я хотел бы узнать, есть ли у них какие-то, может быть, очень кратко опыт, да, там, как они, занимаясь научными исследованиями, оказывали содействие к общению.
So it would just be great if you could take a moment to comment on whether or not you have made those applied connections in working with the tribal communities.
Let me answer very briefly because I have to jump up and run off to a lecture that I'm giving in a class in a few minutes. Those are very wise words. Particularly, I was struck by urging the wisdom of urging skepticism and caution on us, because as scholars we can produce beautiful language to talk about how committed we are to the communities we're working in, but bringing them into fruition is another issue. I also can't speak in general about the problem. I can only speak about the communities that I've been engaged with and that I've worked with. And let me try and put the issue in a very brief form. We have communities of Quechua speakers. We don't have larger publics of Quechua speakers. And that's to say, when a Quechua speaker leaves a small community and is in the city, the entire semiosphere is Spanish speaking. If they turn on the radio, turn on television, Spanish language. If they learn to read and They want to read newspapers and engage with the world, Spanish language again. So from my standpoint, the pressing issue is how to get from communities to publics. And that's a very large one, and that requires substantial financial support, and it requires substantial political engagement. This is a political problem. This is not a technical problem.
So I think Professor Mannheim has to go to class. We don't have Michigan time anymore. So I'd just like to thank all the panelists and thank all of you for coming. And we'll reconvene at 1:30.